Hey, my name is Kathleen Moss, and I'm a board-certified holistic nutritionist specializing in women's health, and especially hormones and a detoxed lifestyle. And this series is on premenopause, or also known as perimenopause. And I have one other video that I've done so far in this series, and it just defines perimenopause or premenopause and the age at which it can be onsetting, and also some of the characteristics, including some of the misnomers and misconceptions about premenopause and perimenopause. So I will link that other video at the end of this video if you haven't seen it yet. But today's video is all about signs and symptoms of premenopause or perimenopause. And most of what I've learned on the subject, I have to give credit to Sara Gottfried, a doctor, an MD, down in the Bay Area, as my really huge mentor in this area. She's written some excellent books, and most of what I'm going to be talking about today comes from what I've learned from her book that is called The Hormone Cure. I don't have the dust jacket on this book anymore, but there's the title, The Hormone Cure, by Dr. Sara Gottfried. This book's about 9 years old, but it's still very, very accurate and up to date. And her more recent book on the subject of both hormones and genes, so genetics and their interplay with women's health and hormones, is called Younger. And I do have the paperback of that copy, so I'll show you that one too. So she's definitely my favorite author on the subject of women's hormones and hormone health, and she's got books coming out all the time, so I definitely would watch her and follow her on Instagram if you're interested in this subject. But today I'm just going to give a list of the signs and symptoms that you might be entering premenopause or perimenopause. And again, this can happen anytime after your mid-30s, and for me it did happen in my late 30s, early 40s. And a lot of these symptoms can come all at once, and it can be very overwhelming and disorienting. And for me, myself, it was very, very confusing and disorienting, especially since no one had told me about the phenomena of perimenopause, premenopause, and the symptoms that are pretty typical in this age, way before you hit menopause. So for more on that, definitely see my last video, but I'm just going to go right into the signs and symptoms now. So in premenopause, the first phase, we're dealing with a lowered amount of progesterone, and that is very similar to an elevated amount of estrogen, because progesterone and estrogen pretty much have to be equal in our systems in order for it to not feel like we have too much of one and too little of the other. So if we're lowering our progesterone, we're almost always going to have the same symptoms as if we were heightening our estrogen, if that makes sense. And so I have a list of different symptoms for both of these phenomena, both the lowered progesterone and the heightened estrogen. Even though you may still have very, very low estrogen, as long as your progesterone is lower than your estrogen, you will likely experience symptoms of each. So for lowered progesterone, some of the very, very typical symptoms that we experience as women in our late 30s and early 40s when we start to experience this lowered amount of progesterone is we have some weight and bloating kind of symptoms first off, and we can gain weight in our hips and our butt especially, and that would be weight in the form of fat. And we can also experience a lot of belly bloating, so like day-to-day fluctuation in how large our belly is, and mostly not having to do with fat, but more like a water retention or even just a gassiness in our belly. So it can go up and down day to day and depending on what we eat for sure, but a lot more fluctuation in belly bloating and a sense of extra heaviness and fullness in our belly. Now we also can gain weight in our breasts at this period in time, and the weight we gain in our breasts is definitely not bloating, and it's definitely not fat. It is in the form of fibrous tissue or cysts, and this is something that is extremely typical these days. If you have fibrous breasts to begin with, if you have more solid breasts and less droopy breasts, then you're going to tend to have this symptom in your 30s and 40s especially. And I've experienced this myself big time. Looking back, it's way easier to see than at the time of the starting of the process. But in my 20s, I had a C cup in my bra size, and in my 30s, I crept up to a D pretty quickly by my mid 40s, and then throughout my later 40s, I was up to a double D. And this was not in the form of fat. This was very, very dense fibrous tissue. And it is a very serious sign of low progesterone and excess estrogen in the body. And it's a little bit of a warning sign that you have estrogen problems and estrogen metabolism and detox problems, and could possibly be an early sign of breast cancer as well. So it's definitely worth watching and monitoring pretty closely. So speaking of fibrous tissue, you might get some in your breast, but you can also get fibroids down in your endometrial area, down around your uterus, on the outside of your uterus. And you can also get fibrous cysts on the inside of your uterus called polyps. And this is another sign of low progesterone, excess estrogen. And this can also lead to a symptom that is really hard to miss, which is heavy bleeding and decreased time between periods. So if you have an experience of heavy bleeding, your gynecologist or your general doctor will definitely point you to getting some ultrasounds to see if there are any fibroids or polyps going on in your uterus, especially if you have extreme heavy bleeding and you're not able to leave your home in the morning because of it. I experienced this phenomena too. I'm a really good candidate for all of these examples. And I did have to have polyps removed from my uterus when I was in my early 40s. And that was my first cancer scare. Definitely have a lot of concern around polyps in the uterus because they are considered to be precancerous in many cases. And your doctor will take it very seriously. I actually had the suggestion of having uterine ablation, which I did not choose to do, and thankfully my polyps have not returned. The surgeon that did take my polyps warned me that I probably would have a return in polyps, and thankfully I've been able to manage my estrogen levels really well and been able to avoid having polyps returning and having further surgeries for that. And I did not opt for the ablation, which is kind of like the burning and cauterizing of the interior of your uterus. That didn't sound pleasant to me, and it just didn't fit me spiritually, because I definitely consider my uterus to be a creative and spiritual place in my body, and I just didn't feel like doing that. And for me, it has paid off, but many, many women do feel really good about the ablation process and are really glad that they've gotten it. So it is definitely an option for those who tend to grow uterine polyps and have a lot of heavy bleeding as a result. The next major area when you're experiencing either lowered progesterone or heightened estrogen is the area of emotions. And this is something that really harkens back to our adolescence, when we're experiencing fluctuating hormones for the first time in our lives. In my experience with me and my clients, I've seen that what tends to happen is whatever happened in your adolescent years, whether it was anxiety or depression or just really touchiness and irritability, those kind of emotions will return at this point when your progesterone is getting lower. And so during your late 30s, early 40s, it is very typical to feel a season of whatever that moodiness was that you experienced in adolescence. If you didn't experience any moodiness in adolescence, chances are you won't in perimenopause or premenopause either. But I personally did. I had a whole summer of really strong depression when I was a teenager, and I experienced that in my early 40s as well as I was shifting into premenopause. And depression in particular is not something that is easy to identify in yourself. It kind of sweeps over you like a fog, and it's not something that even those of us who are very self-aware and have a lot of good in touchness with our emotions can even identify until it's already been happening for a while. So if you are experiencing some of these other signs and symptoms of premenopause, I encourage you to talk to those closest to you who live with you especially, and ask them if you seem at all depressed to them. Because this would be another sign, a very worrying sign of maybe needing something like a very low dose of bioidentical hormone therapy that could address that mood for a very short period of time. I did progesterone, just over-the-counter strength, natural progesterone cream, not progestins, no synthetic or pharmaceutical based, but just a very small amount of cream that I put on my inner arms, and that addressed my mood problems during my early 40s until they had passed. And so I'm a big advocate for that, and definitely would encourage you to talk to your doctor about doing that if you have mood problems because of your fluctuating hormones. You may not have depression. You may have other things like irritability or anxiety and sleeplessness and some insomnia. Those are all related mood problems, and like I said, they're probably very unique to you and your own experience with hormone fluctuation. A really bummer symptom of perimenopause or premenopause is a kind of a foggy-headedness and memory problems or brain fog. And word recognition or word recall is really frustrating at this time of life because of this. And it is a very typical sign of having heightened estrogen levels or higher than optimal estrogen levels in our body. And again, don't be too hard on yourself. Just know that you're not alone. There are so many other women that are going through this, especially in their 40s and 50s. We can also have a loss of libido, which is a really big bummer. It has to do with estrogen and testosterone and how they interact with each other as we're going through these kind of tumultuous changes with progesterone. And these are not easy things to get over, but this video is just to help you feel like you're not alone, and this is a normal thing to expect at these times of life these days. And estrogen dominance and low progesterone are a big issue that we're learning more and more about, and there's more and more information about how to solve these problems. And so stay tuned for future videos about all of these things. Finally, a symptom of too high estrogen and maybe too low progesterone is a tendency towards being more sedentary and having lower energy. So being less motivated to go to the gym if that was something that has been normal for you in your life, putting it off till tomorrow, not having the get up and go that you once had. This is a very normal and typical sign of lowered progesterone and out of whack estrogen. And again, this is something you can expect and shouldn't be too surprised by, and that is somewhat addressable with diet and lifestyle, and certainly with a healthy, natural hormone supplementation plan that might be temporary. All of these signs and symptoms are mix and match. Some of us will have a lot of a few of them and none of the others. Almost none of us will have all of these signs and symptoms. But you might have some of them in your late 30s and others in your early 40s and others in your mid 40s. Again, like I said in my last video, a lowered progesterone level has nothing to do with the entry into the actual time of menopause when you have lowered estrogen. It's a very different phenomena. And so you'll look for different symptoms during that latter time of premenopause. The symptoms that I'm talking about now is in the early stages of premenopause and comes way before menopause in most cases. So I don't want you to confuse it with lowering estrogen levels. That is a whole different set of symptoms, and I'll talk about that in some future series on menopause itself and the transition to menopause, which is at the very end of premenopause. Very different than the signs and symptoms that we experience in the beginning of premenopause. So as unsatisfying as it is to just make a video like this that lists all of the signs and symptoms and not show any of the solutions, I just wanted to keep it to that today, and I'm just taking bite-sized conversations out of this big, huge, important topic of premenopause. And so my future videos will touch on some of these particular individual problems, symptoms, and projects to solve, and talk a little bit about my own story and how I've solved a lot of these on my own and for my clients as a nutritionist. I hope that this video has helped you to feel more normal. That's what reading these books about hormones did for me when I was going into premenopause. I felt really crazy, honestly, and I felt very alone. And learning that there was a name for what I was going through was so reassuring for me. And that's why I make these videos, and that's why I'm here for you. I want you to feel like you're not alone and that this is somewhat normal. As unfortunate as it is and uncomfortable as it is, there are ways through it and ways to address what you're going through. And there is definitely a lot of life and hope on the other side of it. And so hang in there if you're going through some of these symptoms. I just want to give you a word of encouragement and let you know that a lot of us have been there and come through it and are doing really well. I just turned 50 yesterday, and so you can see that I'm doing really well. And so I'd love to share some of my tips and secrets with you along the way as I go toward menopause itself. I will see you in the next videos on this series of premenopause and perimenopause, what to expect, and some tips and tricks for helping you along the way. I hope you'll join me in those future videos by subscribing now, and I'll see you there. Bye-bye.